what could have happened? What if propagandists for the edible oil industry have hijacked nutrition science? Here's how I want to structure the talk. We're going to start out with the hidden history of the American Heart Association, and then we're going to target the problem, the fact that we're getting sicker and medical science hasn't really been helping as much as I think it could. And the solution, just fix medical education. It's not as hard as you might think. These are my disclosures. My research is supported by, in part, by money I make from selling my books. And this is my latest book, Dark Calories. So let's start with the American Heart Association. Story begins in Chicago in the 20s when a bunch of doctors got together. These doctors were cardiologists, and they had noticed that heart disease had been increasing, and they wanted to kind of get together and talk about it. They founded what we now know as the American Heart Association in 1924. And this graph shows that they'd already seen, so this is the 1920s, they'd already seen an increase, pretty steep increase, considering it went from what looks like maybe around a dozen to possibly over 100 deaths per 1,000 people from heart disease. And at that point in time, heart disease had been primarily an infectious disease. And at that point in time, doctors could go their entire careers and never see what they called then the coronary, which we now know as a myocardial infarction or heart attack. And so that was the beginning. That was the beginning of the American Heart Association. And as you can see by this line, heart attack rates kept on increasing for a long time. So we fast forward to 1939 and 1948, when the American Heart Association starts getting more aggressive or getting more ambitious, and had broken into two groups of members. There were what I call the expansionists, who were getting kind of frustrated with the fact that they actually did not have a lot of money, in part due to the expenses of the Great Depression and all that financial stress. The fact that heart attacks were increasing and they didn't have a good handle on what was the cause. But then there was this other group who were very conservative, and they were really concerned that they warned that so the expansionists were saying, in case you can't read this, they wanted to engage PR firms and start fundraising because we must have money to carry on what we want to do. While the conservatives warned that public relations could lead to undignified publicity and unjustified claims about the cure of heart disease. And that phrase will come back to haunt us. So meanwhile, a company called Procter & Gamble, who sold products made with vegetable oils, mostly soy oil and cottonseed oil, they had a problem because they were producing more and more of these products, but they couldn't really sell them as fast as they could produce them. Specifically, the products that they had a hard time selling were the edible products. So they turned cottonseed and soy into a bunch of stuff, soap and detergents and candles and waxes. But they also, around the turn of the century, had learned to turn it into Crisco, which was vegetable shortening. And that was sold as a substitute for lard. They also were able to sell the hydrogenated form as margarine, which would be a substitute for butter. They couldn't get people to really get interested in buying the liquid oils, though, which was the easiest thing to make. And so they really wanted to unload more of this stuff because they had a ton of it. They had been producing a lot of it for the war effort, because soy is a fantastic crop for squeezing into oil that you could then use to lubricate all the machinery that they were using to fight and win World War II. So at the end, though, they had all this extra soy oil that suddenly, the farmers were dumping on them. And it was like, well, we got to do something with this. Such an opportunity here. So what did they do? But they hired a man named Ed Bernays, who, if you are in marketing at all, which probably you're not if you're in medical school, you might have heard this name. Ed Bernays is actually considered a giant in the field of public relations and propaganda. Some people consider him the father of the whole thing. Who is he? He is actually a nephew of Sigmund Freud, the famous psychiatrist. And what he did, why that matters, is because previous to him, most advertisers appealed to our cognition, our sense of logic and the practical aspects of a product, whether it was the cost, how long it would last, what it could do for you. But what Ed Bernays realized was that emotions were a much more powerful lever to get people to do stuff. And so he was a master at pulling those levers, and he wrote a bunch of books. One of them is one of the most famous, called Propaganda. And he actually, like, I didn't learn about him, but I feel like my history education was a little deficient because he was a consultant to 4 different presidents, the CIA for many years, the FBI, and if you ever heard of the banana republics in Central and South America in I think it was 60s and 70s, that was his idea, and those continue. The Banana Republics was the United Fruit Company, kind of deposed of a democratically elected person, and was this Ed Bernays was the engineer of all of that, and that continues to influence politics throughout, the Central America today. So he's an important guy, and he was very smart. And what he decided to do that would solve the problem for his client, Procter and Gamble, who wanted to unload more of that oil, was this. He said, "Why don't we have you donate a lot of money to the American Heart Association?" So the figure was dug up by a journalist named Nina Teicholz, who wrote a book called Big Fat Surprise, which is a really good book. She found this exact figure in the meeting minutes, and it translates to about 30 million today. So what he did, though, was he created like a kind of a middleman, so that it wasn't obvious that Procter and Gamble basically gave the American Heart Association all this money. It was in coordination with Hollywood, with Jack Benny, who had a radio program, and they had like an annual walkathon. And so his idea was to have people call in and say why they want the American Heart Association to be the beneficiary of all that money this year. And so like that made it look like it was just an outpouring of public support. They loved the American Heart Association, who of course they never would have heard of if they had not heard the name on the Jack Benny radio show. Anyway, it was brilliant. And it worked. So what this did, though, this relationship between Procter and Gamble, who sold vegetable oil, and the American Heart Association was unique. This was really groundbreaking in terms of, industry and medical research development, the way things would go for the next, well, until now, because it was the first time that an organization had been basically influenced, now capable of being influenced by the money that they got from industry. Previously, it was up to like advertisers to like pay an individual doctor. Individual doctors would take money and promote some brand of cigarettes, right, or whatever it was. But this was an entire medical organization, so much more powerful effect, and indeed it does continue to this day. But what was the effect? So that was 1948. By 1956, the American Heart Association got behind vegetable oils. This is from the American Heart Association's website. It's one of their like proud moments in the American Heart Association. 1956, a dietary fat cholesterol link found by Dr. Ansel Keys, who did research funded by the American Heart Association, first links dietary fat with cholesterol. And this discovery spurs the American Heart Association to tell Americans to eat differently. What exactly did they say, and what exactly was his research? Well, it's a bit vague, and the whole thing was a bit vague because, well, you'll see why. So by 1961, this is Ansel Keys himself. Now he's on the cover of Time magazine, and he's warning the entire American public now that butter congeals in our arteries like hot grease in a cold pipe. Now, we know now that butter does not directly enter our arteries. There's these things called lipoproteins. Um, he didn't exactly know that when he first started because he wasn't a doctor, he wasn't a cardiologist, he was a physiologist, but not even a human physiologist. He was an eel physiologist. So he did not know about lipoproteins. But when he learned about them, he didn't really correct the message. And the message has essentially remained unchanged till today. Like you still see very similar images to this fat, and oil and grease buildup in medical texts, right? That's the pathophysiology of heart attacks, but it's not like that. And when you dig a little deeper, you see it starts in the wall. There's this been long ongoing argument between, is it a disease of the lumen or a wall? Well, it's a disease of the wall. So this idea, this image that was not based in science, it was based in a lack of knowledge of science, has stayed with us because we are so influenced by images. And the influence continued. There were decades and decades of ads for vegetable oils in all kinds of magazines, including doctors' magazines and Newsweek. I remember seeing one when I was little, and that magazine was advertising about how great margarine was and how dangerous butter was. And I remember running to the fridge to make sure we didn't have any dangerous butter. All of these ads, well, a lot of them, actually have little disclaimers citing evidence, supposedly evidence, from the American Heart Association as support for their claims that you need to polyunsaturate your family or your grandmother or your children or whatever with this wonderful vegetable oil. Now, one thing you do not see on the American Heart Association is any information about the funding, that it came from Procter & Gamble. There's no mention of the Walking Man contest, no mention of Procter & Gamble. I tried searches a bunch of different ways. I couldn't see any disclosure that they had actually received a lot of money from, this kind of what launched their existence from basically a bunch of doctors with ambitions but no money to now a huge organization that runs medical education practically. And I believe there's a big problem with this relationship, right? The making unfounded claims, words to haunt us, kind of came true, and you don't even have to dig too hard to see evidence of it. What I'm showing you is another screenshot from the American Heart Association's own website. This is like 100 years of their proud history. Right on their website, they tell you that in 1961, they started changing how Americans ate. The AHA issues its first dietary guidelines in 61, which recommended replacing saturated fats found in red meat, cheese, butter, and other animal products with unsaturated fats, like polyunsaturated fats especially. And so they're admitting that they changed the way that we eat in 1961. However, right here they say that research to test this in humans did not even begin until 2 years afterwards, right? So the point I'm making here is we believe we practice evidence-based medicine. The American Heart Association claims to make evidence-based advice, yet all of this began with no evidence. You can look and look and try to find evidence, and you won't find any. People have done this. So an independent group of researchers published an article in Open Heart in 2015 called Evidence from Randomized Controlled Trials Did Not Support the Introduction of Dietary Fat Guidelines in 1977. They're referring to the government guidelines, which ultimately became the food pyramid, then the food plate, and then what we have now. And also it didn't still even, there was no evidence for the next set of guidelines, which came out in 1983. So the fact that there was no evidence doesn't seem to move the needle in terms of the American Heart Association's policies or our medical education. This was published in a, peer-reviewed journal by really reputable researchers. I did not hear about this in any continuing medical education lecture that I have attended. I did not see it published. I'm a family physician. I did not see anything written about it in American Academy of Family Physician journals, which I read every month. There's a big defect here. There's a big flaw in our education. And this Dr. George Mann believes so too. So who's Dr. George Mann? Well, if you've heard of the Framingham studies, which are ongoing, so hopefully you've heard of them. Plus, I think you're right near them. Wait, no, you're in Rhode Island, not Massachusetts. The Framingham studies started, in the 60s, and this guy, George Mann, actually designed the nutrition arm and was in charge of it for at least like the first 20 years. And during that time, he was quoted in various unpopular journals for saying things like, it's been a waste of money. We really haven't found any evidence. And I picked this quote because it's one of the most alarming and frankly dystopian quotes I've found. He says, the results of the Framingham study were edited and written up for public consumption to create the wrong impression. So, that's bad. It's falling just a little bit short of saying, well, yeah, they lied a lot, which I think at this point in time, we can say things like that now. I mean, it's not looking good for what medical science has been our track record. So that's why maybe my language is a little bit stronger than some other people that you've been listening to. Where did this quote come from? It came from a book published in 1974 called The Cholesterol Controversy, which is a great book published by a great physician named Edward Pickney, who was very influential in the 60s and 70s. Not some fringe theory here. Another thing I want to show you is the cigarette smoking and heart attack data. That's what this slide is. So this graph shows you 3 lines. The red line is heart disease deaths per capita throughout the 20th century till today. The gray line is smoking per capita in the same time period. And as you can see, those 2 red and gray lines are quite obviously parallel. And what's this 3rd line down here that doesn't look like it correlates at all? Well, that's saturated fat consumption. So when I was in medical school, which was a while ago now in the 90s, I learned that saturated fat was on the rise, and that's why we were having heart attacks. I did not see this data, but this is data. This is actual data. I put this together, and this is from my book, actually, and the sources are in my book. But if anybody's curious, sorry, I didn't put all the sources on here. There's a lot of them. It took a lot to put this together. But so the point is, there's 2 points. One is there was obviously the correlation was obvious already in 1950s between cigarettes and heart disease deaths. But the American Heart Association did not say anything about cigarettes causing heart attacks. And in fact, back here in 1961, where Time magazine quotes Ancel Keys, he directly says that he doesn't think cholesterol or, he doesn't think smoking plays a role or a significant role. He thinks that it's all about the cholesterol and the saturated fat. Even though there were other doctors who disagreed with him, Ancel Keys downplayed the role, and Ancel Keys' voice won out, even though there wasn't any data. Quite impressive, I think. Meanwhile, the American Heart Association failed to warn people that there was a link between smoking and heart attacks. So there's a big moral failing there. And I think that they are responsible, at the very least, for people continuing to smoke for a lot longer. It wasn't until the 1970s that the Surgeon General came out with the official warning. And that's what made my dad quit. We've continued to pump out more evidence that saturated fat is not correlated with heart disease, and it continues to get ignored. This is a bunch of studies that were published on Healthline, which is a pretty reputable, I'm sure you guys have read stuff from Healthline, and they're showing that just in the past 4 years, there's been at least 5 studies in peer-reviewed articles that there's no evidence about saturated fat. So what I just said is not how science is supposed to work. This is here. So this, if you don't know this gentleman, this is from a very popular show called Big Bang Theory, and it went 12 seasons. And this is Sheldon Cooper, the main character, who is a nerdy physicist who's really annoying. But one of the reasons we all love him is that even though he had major setbacks in his career because his ideas were proven wrong, he rolled with that reality and kept looking for moved with the science. He did what the science says. We're not doing that in medicine. That's bad. The American Heart Association is still recommending that we eat less saturated fat and more of these oils. And I just want to point out that olive oil is fine, but these other oils, corn, canola, cottonseed, sunflower, safflower, and vegetable oil, those are all the polyunsaturated fats that I think that we're going to talk about more later about why I think they're really bad for us. So we have a problem in this country, in the world, that people are getting sicker. Medical science isn't helping. We're really good at making diagnoses. We're really good at distinguishing between heart failure and heart attack and migraine headaches and brain tumor headaches. But are we helping people improve their health? Well, I'm going to show you that I don't think so. So first of all, this is personal for me. My family has been affected. My brothers and sisters have all struggled with very serious health challenges that my parents didn't have to deal with, and my grandparents certainly didn't have to deal with. This is my grandparents on the left who are in stellar health until their 80s. My grandmother lived to be 103. Her only serious medical problem was she was absolutely stone cold deaf. But I remember on her 100th birthday, she was doing the foxtrot. Whereas you compare that to us, this is me and my siblings on my dad's motorcycle, we have had serious stuff, including leukemia and surgeries. It's happening to more and more of us. It's not just me, my family. Back in the mid 2000s, when I first started figuring out that I kind of maybe been sold a bill of goods during my medical education and looking at what was going on with our health and questioning everything, I found a lot of bad news in terms of statistics. And you have to realize that back at this point in time, we had come off of a century, the 20th century, of life longevity improvements. So the medical, the thought was in the 1990s, kids born in the 1990s might live to be 120. But I was seeing otherwise in my own clinic, and I saw it in my own family, and I saw it in the statistics. So this is brain tumors in children were on the rise. Young adult diabetes was already on the rise by 2006. Childhood asthma was going up, birth defects were going up, depression going up, childhood obesity already increasing by 2006. Nearsightedness, which you might not think of as related to diet, but I can explain that later if anyone has questions. Schizophrenia, inflammatory bowel, not irritable, but inflammatory, the serious kind. Childhood migraine, adolescent obesity, and then autism. Now, people have argued that it's not 700%, but it's certainly multiple hundreds of percents, right? Some people, like this figure came out a long time ago, and it's been massaged a few times, and we think maybe there's some overdiagnosis or improved awareness, of course, but it's still in the multiple hundreds. It's definitely increasing. It's a problem. And as a result, so the generation that was supposed to live to be 120 is now starting already to showing signs of age at the ripe old age of 27. This is from a report from Blue Cross and Blue Shield that came out in 2017. It got some publicity then because it was shocking. It was shocking to the Blue Cross and Blue Shield themselves. And, it's just shocking that people are starting to age in their 20s now. This is not when our health is supposed to be deteriorating, but that's what was happening. And in the reports, they said, this was much earlier than any previous generation. And as our health has been getting worse, it's been drawing attention from businesses because businesses can't run when people are sick. Plus, it's costing a lot. Health insurance is getting extraordinarily, insanely expensive. This graph shows that since 1960, as a percentage of the GDP, it's outpaced the growth in our gross domestic product. Currently, it's 5 times the gross domestic product. It's the number one thing that the government spends money on. And this is not sustainable. Now, what's causing any of this? Well, when you look into that, you'll see that all of these many things, and this is just a smattering of the things, have been identified as contributing to one or more of the conditions that I showed you that are all on the rise. Now, what you don't see here is vegetable oil. You don't see soy oil, corn oil, canola oil, the term vegetable oil, but you do see saturated fat. You do see forever chemicals. You do see suburban living, whatever that means, however that's supposed to be a problem. Um, but like it literally almost, it seems to me everything under the sun except for vegetable oils, the heart healthy vegetable oils. But let's take a look at how much we're eating in the history of soy oil consumption. So getting back to that campaign with that genius Ed Bernays and how effective it was, as you can see, in 1909, there wasn't much consumption of soybean oil. It started to increase right around the end of World War II. Um, and then it increased even more as the American Heart Association started promoting it. There's this other inflection point here, right around when we have the government starts getting involved, and there's just more propaganda. Those some of those magazines were from the late 60s, early 70s, and you can see that really soybean consumption has absolutely exploded. Um, Now, soybean is just one of the problematic oils that I've identified as problematic. There's a collection of 8, and this is the 8. There's corn, canola, cottonseed, soy, sunflower, safflower, grapeseed, and rice bran. This is on my website if anybody don't have to worry about writing it down. So when you add so what I did, I created this graph here, just because should be like, we should think about this. What this is showing is this red line is you add up all those 8 seed oils, and this is the volume that we've been consuming over the past century with the best possible data. It wasn't really easy to get a lot of data, so there's probably some errors in here. But anyways, generally, this is the slope. And as you can see, it's parallel to this other line. Well, what is this? Type 2 diabetes and prediabetes. Oh, also obesity almost looks exactly the same. Parallel. Pretty close correlation here. What are these other lines? Well, carbohydrate does not parallel this. Like we hear all the time that we're, eating too much carb and sugar. Sugar's included in the carb here. You can see that our carb consumption went up, and maybe you could say that it's doubled since the 60s, but not compared to seed oils. And of course, not compared to historically. It kind of went down for a little while in the 60s and 70s. And certainly not butter, lard, or margarine. Okay, so this, I think, is an important piece of data that nobody's talking about. Again, I never heard anybody talk about this in any medical lecture that I've attended. I've seen nothing in medical journals. Silence. Seems important to me. Now, the past 20 years is even more interesting. If we hone in on what happened between the year 2000 and the year 2020 in terms of our consumption of certain key variables in our diet and our obesity, it gets even more interesting. So our obesity doubled. The rates were 20%, and now in 2020 anyway, they're 42. I think it's gone up since then. Our seed oil calories were 340 liquid seed oil calories, and they've doubled almost 700. This is an incredible amount of calories of something that, the average person is either consuming or available per day. When you try and look up this stuff, a lot of people do not distinguish between what's available and what's consuming. So I'm just doing my best here. This does seem to be what some people are consuming, but it might just be what's available. Either way, the correlations hold, the relative values hold. So let's look at calories, because everybody says, calories are making us fat. We're eating too much. Obviously, that's the reason. Well, wait a second. Total calories available between in 2000 were 3750, and 20 years later, 50 calories more. That does not explain the doubling in obesity. Now let's look at some of these other usual suspects. Total carb, wheat, beef, red meat, added sweeteners, and high fructose corn syrup all declined. By how much? Well, high fructose corn syrup, which has become like the poster child of what's making us fat, that went down by 60% since the year 2000. Why are we still obsessing with sugar? I mean, sure, sugar's not good for you. Why aren't we talking about the obvious thing here? because they're heart healthy. So that's a problem. It's a problem that we have that perception. Okay, so what are these oils? Let's learn a little bit more about them, right? So this is what I call them, hateful eight. They make you fat, tired, they inflame your body. Don't eat them. Um, this is what we're supposed to think, right? This is what the advertising shows us. This is a lie. Just right here, this is not, they're not yellow, right? They don't have this golden yellow color. This is fake. This is coloring is added. It's clear because of the processing. Removes all the additives, I'm sorry, removes all the colorizing agents, which were nutrients. Um, and let's show you what it really looks like. Let's get real here. This is what soy oil looks like when it is first squished out of the soy. It's a little video. Hopefully the video translates just so you can see that it is a thick, viscous looking liquid. And if you were to smell this, it would kind of burn your nose and burn your eyes. It is acrid. It is considered inedible. This is called crude oil. When you squish soybeans at the temperatures that they use and with the pressure and the other things that they have to do to get the oil out of there, you create this disgusting, inedible product. This is unique, right? I mean, it's not unique to soy. All the other 8 oils have this same thing. When I say unique, I mean there's nothing else in the food supply that is considered inedible at really any point along the food, along its manufacture, right? It has to be rendered edible and safe to consume. It can't be fed to animals, by the way. It has to go through processing in factories that look like oil and gas refineries. And the processes there are very similar. They are pulling off different fractions in an oil and gas refinery to make your motor oil versus your gasoline versus the other products that they make. Well, the same idea happens when they refine this crude oil to make seed oils. This is the dewaxing phase, and I'm going to show you this. This is from a regular old factory in America, the canola factory. This is the waxes that come off. It looks to me like the definition of toxic sludge. But this is the source material for vegetable shortening, which gets added to pastries and all kinds of candies, as well as lots of pet foods. This is where they pull off the gums. It's called the degumming step. This is gum. And this goes off to a whole different factory and gets turned into a white powder that we call lecithin, which is added to make mayonnaises, many sauces, and chocolate even. So clearly there's a lot of processing steps here in making this stuff. And just to compare the complexity of this newfangled oil that did not exist before the industrial era that's supposed to be good for us to a traditional oil, what does that look like when you make it? It looks like this. So olive oil, step 1, crush them in a big stone. Or something more sophisticated if you want to. Step 2, centrifuge, or what they used to do, which was they just sort of let it sit for a while and the particulates would fall to the bottom. They would filter them out. This oil, what we call this crude oil, we call this virgin olive oil, and it's edible. Now, and then you can put it in a bottle. And you're done. Much simpler. Now, why does all this matter? What is actually happening? It turns out something very important is happening. It's called, the concept here is you develop process contaminants. Those are things that are not in the raw material that develop due to the processing. And this explains why soybeans are perfectly fine to eat. Corn is perfectly fine to eat. Sunflower seeds are perfectly fine to eat. But when you pull off the oil the way that we do, you render something very unhealthy. The process contaminants. What are they? Well, here's a list. This is just some of them. There's others, because there's things like mineral oil. But mineral oil is kind of like, I consider that an outside thing. This is inside out. Where are these coming from? These are coming, all these chemicals, some of which are quite toxic, like 4-hydroperoxy 2-transalkanil. That is an extremely cytotoxic compound known to cause, it's so cytotoxic that it's also its mutagenicity. It's also a cancer-causing chemical, but it killed cells first. They didn't realize it was cancer-causing because it killed cells. When you're a dead cell, you don't develop cancer. Anyway, I digress. So there's serious process contaminants that are forming in these seeds. Where are they coming from? It's coming from the polyunsaturated fat. This supposedly heart health. The reason these oils are supposedly heart healthy. Why? Because polyunsaturated fat reacts with oxygen. It's unstable. It's less stable. Saturated fat does not. It stays saturated fat. You don't develop these awkward chemicals that our body can't use that can have toxic effects. That's the big problem with making a recommendation that goes against all of previous culinary history. Don't eat saturated fat, don't eat animal fat, which people were eating for a long time. Eat these oils that are this different chemical. Well, that was an experimental idea, and this is what we're eating as part of the experiment. And while these things are truly present only in very small quantities, when the bottles first exit the factory, these toxins actually multiply. Because what happens when you do all that refining is you have removed the antioxidants and you allow free radical reactions and oxidation to continue to progress. And these toxins will continue to develop out of the polyunsaturated fats that remain behind. So you have progressively less polyunsaturated fat and progressively more toxin. And each one of these steps exposes it to oxygen or heat and increases the development of toxins. And the scariest thing is on the very top right here, after we eat it, these things continue to form in our bodies. Toxicologists have found that the deep fryer is a toxic sludge, basically. So a toxicologist named Martin Groupfeld, who I'm paraphrasing here, I'm paraphrasing him as saying, eating a French fry is like smoking a cigarette. This is the actual quote. He went to regular fast food joints and tested what was in the French fries and found that if you look at a type of toxin called alpha beta unsaturated aldehyde, which is also present in cigarette smoke, it's a category of toxins that is extremely bad for us, known to be carcinogenic and cytotoxic. There's equivalent toxicity from one cigarette to one French fry. And yet, at least as of 2019, people like Dariush Mozaffarian, our health authorities, the people leading the conversation on what fats are good and what fats are bad, he's from Tufts, are still telling us bizarrely to eat more, as if they just haven't looked at how much we're actually eating compared to how much we were eating 20 years ago. I mean, we doubled in between 2000 and 2020, right? They still want us to eat more. What do you think will happen if we eat more? I mean, it's like this should be, we should be talking about this. So what should we maybe do about it? Well, I have some ideas. I think we seriously need to consider fixing medical education. And it's not that complicated. What we need to do is realize that all of these different diseases, what we call risk factors or what we identify as different diseases, really have the same root cause. And in this case, the root cause is our diet. It's the fact that we eat foods that contain toxins. And we eat a lot of other foods that are not that great. I'll talk about that in a second. But I remember about 20 years ago, there was this concept of common soil where they were linking heart attacks and type 2 diabetes. And I thought that made a lot of sense. And then, as I was starting to think about all of this, I realized it kind of explains absolutely everything else. And as time has progressed, more and more research has linked like everything to one root cause, one process, and that process is oxidation and oxidative stress. And it's so prevalent now in the medical research that you can just ask Google which diseases are linked to oxidation, and it will tell you that, okay, when we're talking about oxidation, we need to know this term called oxidative stress. And that is a process, a cellular process of imbalance that leads to what? Like everything. cancer, atherosclerosis, diabetes, neurodegenerative disease, chronic kidney disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. I think that hits on the top like 10 killers, maybe. And eye diseases, where they're talking about is macular degeneration there, diabetic eye diseases, blindness, cause of blindness. So it's looking like truly the one root cause really should be considered to be oxidative stress. And if then we think, okay, well, what do we do to not have oxidative stress? Then we can solve a lot of problems, right? So what is oxidative stress? What does it really do? Where does it come from? What is it? To conceptualize it a little bit, it helps to think of it as an imbalance in the pro-oxidant factors and the antioxidant factors. We need to breathe air because air, oxygen is a high energy molecule, drives all our energy production. And just the process of mitochondria producing energy promotes some oxidative stress. But we can create but we have antioxidants to help control that amount of oxidative stress. However, when we expose ourselves to too much toxic exposures, we create an imbalance, and that causes oxidative stress that can foment all these diseases. And seed oils and toxic additives are some of the top things that I think are important to pay attention to. Other environmental toxins, glyphosate and stuff like that, the forever chemicals, all those things that were on that list. Emotional stress even promotes oxidative stress. Lack of exercise does too. Sleep deprivation does. All these things lead to disease. So this is the common soil that leads to all disease, premature death, degeneration, suffering of all kinds. We can get a handle on it by eating whole foods and following a healthy lifestyle. Not that complicated, right? I didn't read about this in any like medical journal, medical textbook or whatever. I think it's very important. I think we should be teaching this. What we are hearing is this latest buzzword about how ultra processed food. You guys have probably heard of ultra processed food. Now that's what they're talking about. I just call that junk food. To tell people that junk food is bad, seems like a tautology. But now when we say ultra processed food, it's like we're really smart. We've discovered something really important. Ultra processed food is a dumb term. I mean, just being blunt here. They don't define it. It's meaningless. You try to look for a definition, you're going to find a list. Gin, rum, ice cream, ham, sausage, something that people have managed to produce for thousands and thousands of years. Suddenly it's ultra processed and we shouldn't eat it. That does not make sense to me. Here's what makes sense. I think the real problem with our diet is that it's mostly refined macros. Our fat is mostly seed oils. That's 30% of our calories. Our carb is mostly refined flours and sugars. That's 37% of our calories. Our protein is increasingly powders and slurries, like whey protein, casein protein, pea protein, stuff that's in like all these vegan stuff, fake dairies and things like that. Lots of bodybuilding stuff is highly processed, refined macros. What's wrong with a refined macro? It doesn't have very much other than the macro. It's almost empty calories. In fact, sugar is the very definition of empty calories. It's no nutrition, but it can make you fat. Only 30% of our diet comes from whole foods, and that even includes some whole foods that aren't particularly healthy, like rice and potatoes. So no wonder we're all getting extremely sick. No wonder we can't get healthy. No wonder people can't lose weight and keep it off unless they're on drugs. I mean, this is not a mystery, folks. We're not eating right. We're eating like terrible. This is absolutely horrible. And it's this simple. We don't need Tufts food compass to help us understand what we should and shouldn't eat and complicated numbers. We should be looking on ingredients labels. And if our food is mostly seed oils, refined flours and sugars, or protein powders, we should avoid it. Simple. Now, how do you link that to oxidative stress and to disease? I'm sorry, how do you link these processed ingredients to disease? It's through oxidative stress. So the refined macros promote oxidative stress. Oxidative stress promotes disease. Very simple. I think that this should be part of standard medical education. So today, I'm maybe making history by introducing it to medical students for the first time, to my knowledge. Of course, maybe you've heard this before from somebody else, but I haven't heard it anywhere else. So This is kind of a technical slide here. So what I'm showing you is that the most common fatty acids, the fatty acids that are called unsaturated, polyunsaturated fatty acids in soy oil and canola oil and so on, they're unsaturated, but they are prone to oxidation. And this is basic chemistry that they turn into different toxic compounds when they oxidize. Peroxides, aldehydes, aldol addition products, condensation products. Many of these things are toxic. Many of these things can turn around and attack the parent molecule, and this is how you get chain reactions, and this is why you get toxins multiplying in the bottle before you even open it. This is why you get toxins forming so intensely that French fries are as bad for you as cigarettes. This is not really something you should be disputing. However, the experts out there are disputing it. And the experts are like denying everything that I've been talking about in terms of the oxidation of the oils and the toxicity. And in fact, they even deny that there's any expert behind the buzz about seed oils. Now, probably by now, many of you have seen like social media of people talking about seed oils being bad and some of these things that I've been seeing. Um, when people debunk this concept, they don't tie it back to any science. They don't tie it back to me. They even use my term, the hateful eight, and never mention me. They just want to leave it as if it's a social media trend, and they debunk it. And let me show you why they do what I just called pseudo debunking. They address the wrong-headed arguments and ignore the elephant in the room. Why I want you to hear this is because if you listen to me and then you go out there and you Google it, you're going to find folks from Harvard, from Tufts, from Stanford who are defending these oils as healthy and debunking the social media trend. And this is what they bring up. They they say, yeah, sure, the omega-6 fatty acids are inflammatory, which is not what I'm saying, by the way, but other people out there are saying that's why they're unhealthy. Um, so they address like the weakest part of the argument. Omega-6 fatty acids are the precursors to the pro-inflammatory eicosanoids and prostaglandins that you hopefully all remember something about from your basic chemistry days. And omega-3 are the precursors to the anti-inflammatory prostaglandins. And seed oils have much more omega-6 than omega-3, and therefore our diets do now as well. And however, that is not the root cause of most of our problems. This has been tested, and it doesn't seem to be anyway. It's not good, but it's not as bad as all the rest. Some seed oils do contain hexane, and most of it's removed. That's not the problem. That's nothing like what I'm talking about. Seed oils do contain trace amounts of trans fats, but so do dairy products, they say. This is misinformation because those are different trans fats. Trans fats is a category of molecules, and the ones that you find in seed oils are toxic. The ones that you find in dairy products, like conjugated linoleic acid, may have anti-cancer properties, very different molecules. The different exact precise molecular configuration matters. They're not even considering. They don't want us to think about that. And then sometimes you'll hear them say, yes, well, some seed oils oxidize easily, and we shouldn't put those in the deep fryers, but not X, whatever one they're promoting, which is often canola. But canola, they all oxidize easily. None of them should be put in deep fryers. Deep frying, by the way, is not healthy. You just really shouldn't eat a lot of fried food. But when you use tallow, you get a lot less toxicity. And that's what used to be in McDonald's when I was a kid. And it was delicious. So they're ignoring the elephant in the room. They're ignoring the problems of oxidation. They're ignoring all those toxins. They're ignoring the multiplication of toxins. They're ignoring the root cause of disease being related to oxidative stress and oxidation. They're just ignoring all that. Fortunately, there's actual really brave doctors out there who some of them have been doing this as long as I have. And they're saying, no, seed oils are actually bad. We shouldn't worry about saturated fat. We should not even worry about cholesterol, which is an even bigger, pill to swallow in terms of things that get debunked. But these folks are making recommendations and improving the lives of their patients. And that's the bottom line. Some of these people have huge social media footprints or written wildly popular books, have influenced millions, and have millions of testimonials of people whose lives have been improved. They've gotten off medications. They've reversed diseases that, were the other doctors told them they would never reverse. They would be on psychiatric drugs the rest of their lives. They would be on autoimmune immune suppressant diseases for things like celiac or lupus for the rest of their lives. And just the last thing, what I want to leave folks with is we deserve better. This is what we deserve. So I got this incredible testimonial on my Instagram feed from a socialite named Davinia Taylor, who is wild all over Instagram. And she had read my books and said to her followers, Dr. Kate Shanahan has literally been the pillar in me getting my mental health back. I no longer feel flatlined. She had talked about how she struggled with alcohol addictions and food addictions, and she just could not, she was like near tears even. I mean, it was really touching. And that was like, that is why I do this. And that is why these other doctors do it, even though this is not a lucrative business to be in, to just tell people to eat better. We're not selling supplements. We're not selling quick fixes. We're just telling people the truth. And it brings back the joy of practicing. And I think that is what, a lot of us go into medicine for, is for the experience of our patients coming back and thanking us because we actually help them. So with that, I will open it up for questions. If you have any, if there's anybody there. Stop share.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Shannon, for that wonderful talk. Are there any questions about what Dr. Shannon just illuminated us on, actually? And I found it one of the most interesting talks I've been at in approximately 45 years of going to medical conferences. I've never seen something as important. The subject matter is very convincingly put together, which I found very, very interesting. It lacks a lot of sort of good, hard science and a lot of clearly defined randomized controlled trials, humans, animals, in vitro culture data, but hopefully that could evolve over time, because the gross epidemiological data, which shows correlations, which is not, of course, causations, right? We don't know the relationship between the two. So any questions for Dr. Shanahan on this subject?
Well, Chris, I do want to say that I didn't present a lot of the detailed science because I wanted to make the larger case and inspire people to look into you'll find tons and tons of animal studies that support this. This is toxicology, and that's different than nutrition. We're dealing with a toxin. So to look for a randomized human clinical trial doesn't make a lot of sense to me, like to ignore the animal toxicology studies, which is generally what happens on social media anyway. I've posted lots of animal studies. Other people have posted lots of animal studies. We have posted observational studies of all kinds. There's a lot of data. I didn't run through it. I wanted to get the concepts. I mean, there's too much data to run through. I've written, 1,500 pages of books, and my last book had 500 references. So there is data. It's just that to get into it is quite technical, and you've got to get the big picture first. This is why I say we need to fix medical education. It's not something we're going to fix in a single lecture, but there is data.
Okay, thank you very much. I know that from a blood transfusion physician, I read many studies about the storage age of red blood cells and effects in animals. And every single study I read in animals showed that if you store red cells for longer periods of time, there are changes that occur which are deleterious in terms of clinical outcome. And yet when we started doing randomized controlled trials in humans in cardiac surgery and premature infants, etc., that data did not pan out at all. There's absolutely no difference in clinical outcome being stored. So animal studies and human studies don't necessarily can be, extrapolated, I think. But that said to you, I'm very impressed with the data. I'm just trying to be obviously critical of the data rather than just being blindly supportive. So could I ask you another question? Nobody wants to. About 10, 15 years ago, we did a study on pigs where we fed pigs atherosclerotic diets and randomized them to take large amounts of alcohol. We actually used vodka to feed the pigs, and they seemed to enjoy it, actually. So that's a whole separate issue. My own role in it was studying platelet function, and we looked at the two groups, and platelet function was not different for what that was worth. But when the pigs were sacrificed, the number of atherosclerotic lesions was far fewer in the pigs that got alcohol versus the pigs that did not get alcohol, which I found rather interesting. Would you any comment? There's been a lot of discussion about alcohol, the Mediterranean diet, wine, and a protective or mitigating effect against atherosclerotic disease. Any comment on that?
Well, we go to the root cause here. So the root cause of atherosclerosis we find is, oxidation. That's why oxidized LDL is, what really is the problem. So oxidized HDL also is the problem. So does alcohol promote oxidative stress, or does it prevent oxidative stress? Well, you'd have to know the details of what the animal was actually eating. Was that alcohol replacing calories that maybe were more toxic? Was it replacing some seed oil calories in their feed? Was it replacing pure sugar calories? Maybe alcohol is metabolized in a way that doesn't, use up so many antioxidants. It is pure energy. I mean, it's two carbon bonds and can be metabolized into ketones, which are some of the best fuel for many of our cells. So, but I think we always have to, I think that's why it's so important to consider that the root cause of disease is oxidative stress, which is something that, again, this theory aligns with that, but I haven't even heard that theory that the root cause of, all disease and aging is oxidative stress, other than in the A4M association, the anti-aging people, but they usually fight it with supplements rather than just a diet that, doesn't contain toxins.
Okay. Thank you very much for that answer. Any other questions from the audience? Well, hearing none, we'd like to thank you very, very much, Dr. Jen, for a wonderful and illuminating talk. And I think a lot of us are going to think an awful lot more about what you said. And overall, in terms of just brainlessly accepting theories advocated by scientists, we should need to be very, very skeptical about what these people say and think for ourselves with regard to what the data really is versus what we're being taught to think versus thinking for ourselves. But thank you very much indeed for the talk.
Well, thank you so much. It's been great to meet you, guys.
Thank you again.